So picture this Megan, barely able to stand, shows up to her mother's birthday dinner, totally sick but trying to keep it together. The room is all glitter and crystal glasses, and she's paying for every single thing while her mother and brother, well, let's just say they're less than grateful. And here's the thing, tension is already thick in the air. You're not gonna believe what happens next. Seriously. But before we dive in, I gotta ask, where in the world are you watching from today? The restaurant was stunning, like seriously exclusive. The kind of place that whispers its own name instead of shouting it. I was at the head of this long, banquet-style table, my palms pressed against the polished surface that felt like ice beneath my fingers. The crystal glasses sparkled as if they were alive. The silverware gleamed under the soft, ambient lighting that made everything feel unreal. And the quiet hum of the city's elite conversations floated in the air. And here I was, paying for every ridiculous detail, every crumb of artisan bread, every overpriced bottle of water, every sip of champagne that tasted like liquid gold. This wasn't just dinner. It was my mother's 71st birthday, and I was sick. Not just emotionally drained, though, believe me, the chronic weight of my family's entitlement was enough to make anyone ill. No, this was physical. 2 days ago, my doctor had laid it out in the plainest terms: walking pneumonia and critical exhaustion, absolute bed rest, zero stress, and a serious cutback on work. That was the prescription. And somehow, I was here anyway. On the phone that morning, my voice rasping and thin. I'd tried to explain, "Mom, I'm really not well. The doctor says I need rest. Can we maybe do a quieter dinner next week when I'm feeling stronger?" Her reaction was immediate. A whip crack of indignation slicing through the line. Absolutely not. "Megan, do you know how long I've been looking forward to this? Frank has already told everyone we're going to alluring. You can't just cancel my birthday. That's the most selfish thing I've ever heard. Just take some medicine. You'll be fine." So, here I was, propped up by a dangerous amount of cold medicine, lungs aching with every shallow breath, head swimming in a low-grade fever, wrapped in a silk dress I'd chosen carefully, plastered on a smile, and hosting 20 of my mother's and brother's closest friends. People whose names I didn't know and who I was pretty sure didn't know mine beyond my function as the family bank. And Frank? Oh, Frank. 42 years old, perpetual aspiring entrepreneur, meaning he never had a job longer than 6 months, was holding court at the other end of the table. Loud, brash, animatedly waving his hands, knocking champagne around, and telling some story about a guaranteed crypto investment. My mother, Margaret, was beaming at him, radiant, silver hair perfectly coiffed, jewelry sparkling under the soft lighting, soaking up every bit of attention. I, on the other hand, was invisible. I had been the architect, the work-obsessed, cold, dutiful daughter who silently carried the weight of their comfortable, luxurious lifestyle ever since my father died. Every detail of their life, condo, car, bills, parties, stipends, mine to fund, theirs to enjoy. My chest ached, and it wasn't the pneumonia alone. Every gesture, every laugh, every cheer from the table felt like salt in an open wound. When the main courses were cleared, I nodded, and the towering chocolate mousse cake arrived, candles blazing. Happy birthday rang out, ragged and rehearsed. Margaret blew out the candles, receiving polite applause. Then Frank, raising his glass, demanded a speech. Margaret, glowing from all the attention, stood up. She thanked her friends for coming. She praised her darling son, Frank, for being her rock, her joy, her everything. 5 full minutes of unabashed admiration for him. And me, I sat there with a smile that felt more like a grimace. Every lavish thing on the table, every bit of food, drink, luxury, it was my contribution, invisible, as always. When she finally sat down, Frank, still standing, raised his glass higher. "And let's not forget my sister, Megan," he announced, sarcastic and pointed. "The family ATM. Thanks for the party, sis." Laughter trickled around the table. That familiar jab, the one he had used for years, landed squarely on my fevered, exhausted body. I tried to shrug it off, but tonight it hit differently. Heat flared beneath my skin, my chest burned, and not from the pneumonia. I decided, slowly, painfully, to stand. The room tilted for a second. I gripped the table for support. I'd also like to say something, I began, my voice huskier than intended. Chatter died down, eyes on me. "Mom," I said, locking eyes with Margaret, "happy birthday. I know this year has been a lot, and I know I work a lot, but I do it so that you and Frank are taken care of, so you don't have to worry. I do it because I love you, and all I've ever really wanted is for you to see me, to love me back." Her expression hardened, smiles vanished, warmth replaced by icy impatience. She cut me off, voice low, carrying in the sudden silence. "Megan, please sit down. You're embarrassing yourself." I stared at her, confused. I just wanted to say happy birthday. Then came the line that shattered years of quiet sacrifice. "You're here out of courtesy, Megan, not because you matter." Silence, thick, suffocating, immobilizing. The guests fiddled with napkins, the waiters froze. I couldn't breathe, not because of the pneumonia. No, this was something else. I turned to Frank, smirk plastered across his face. Conspiratorial stage whisper for all to hear. At least they let you in. And that was it. Pain, humiliation, years of unrecognized effort all coalesced. But then, oddly, clarity, a click, like a lock snapping into place. The burning in my chest wasn't the pneumonia anymore. I looked at my mother, her face a mask of cold indifference. I looked at my brother, his eyes glittering with petty malice, and I smiled. Not a real smile, but the one an architect gives when she finds a compromised, load-bearing wall and knows exactly how to take it down. I lowered myself back into my chair, hands steady as I picked up my fork. "Noted," I said, calm and clear. The betrayal, I realized, wasn't the sickness. The sickness was the cure. It had given me the clarity to see the rot that had been poisoning my life for decades. On the ride home, silent save for the tires on wet pavement, my head spun, fever prickling at the skin, lungs protesting every shallow breath, and yet beneath it all, a new sensation bloomed cold. Hard resolve. Margaret's words echoed, not as an insult, but as diagnosis. I had been operating under the illusion of being a daughter, a sister, a loved part of a family. No, I was a courtesy, a convenience, a service provider, and service providers have contracts, terms, rights, and the right to terminate services when the clients are in breach. I got home, not to sleep, despite doctor's orders, but to my study. to the shelves full of files not of blueprints, but of their lives, the so-called Margaret and Frank Preservation Trust, which was really just my life, my assets, my name, condo deed, vehicle title, joint account for their expenses, all under me. They had forgotten who I was. The boring daughter, the workaholic, the pushover. No. I owned a firm. I designed, built, and managed multi-million-dollar projects. I negotiated, enforced contracts, handled ruthless clients. I wasn't an ATM, they had forgotten. The ATM is connected to a bank that knows the balance. Surrounded by this infrastructure of their existence, I felt the first real surge of power in years. They had underestimated me, assumed my generosity was weakness, my competence a lack of personality, and now, armed with this knowledge, I could act. I wasn't just physically sick anymore. I was strategically alive, aware, and ready to dismantle their entitled little world. I finally let myself breathe, for the first time, like someone who'd been carrying a weight that wasn't theirs to hold, and now knew exactly how to put it down. I slowly pushed myself back from the table, the chair scraping against the polished floor like a quiet alarm in the otherwise perfect room. My hands gripped the edge, knuckles white, and for a moment, the whole world felt like it was tilting. I could feel every eye on me, the sudden silence pressing against my skin. My lungs protested with each shaky breath, my fevered body screaming at me to sit down, to retreat, but I couldn't. Not tonight, not this time. I cleared my throat, voice hoarse but steady enough to carry, I'd like to say something. The clinking of glasses and murmured chatter faded to a hush. I looked directly at my mother, Margaret, her silver hair gleaming under the soft restaurant lighting, her face still radiant, still composed. "Mom," I said, my voice catching slightly. "Happy birthday. I know this year has been a lot, and I know I work a lot, but I do it so that you and Frank are taken care of. So you don't have to worry." I paused, trying to steady the tremor in my voice, my chest aching, my head swimming. "I do it because I love you, and all I've ever really wanted is for you to see me, to love me back." The moment the words left my mouth, I could see the shift. The warmth that had been plastered on her face for Frank vanished, replaced by that familiar, icy patience. She tilted her head, eyes narrowing just enough to make the blood drain from my face. "Megan, please sit down. You're embarrassing yourself." I blinked, utterly thrown, my throat tight. I just wanted to say happy birthday," I whispered, barely loud enough to be heard. And then it came. The words I would never forget. Words that landed with the force of a sledgehammer in the silent room. "You're here out of courtesy, Megan, not because you matter." The air around me thickened, solid, suffocating. Friends shifted in their chairs, their attention diverting to anything but the tension between us. The waiters froze, mid-step, glasses in hand. I couldn't breathe. My lungs burned. My fever felt like molten iron beneath my skin. Not the pneumonia, something else, something sharp, something that cut deeper than any illness. I turned slowly to Frank. There he was, leaning slightly forward, smirk tugging at his lips, eyes glinting with cruel satisfaction. "At least they let you in," he said. Stage whispered for everyone, sharp as glass. The words reverberated, bouncing off the walls, into the edges of my mind, and then something clicked. Not anger, not despair, clarity. Years of silent service, of unacknowledged devotion, of constant sacrifice, all boiled down into a single, crystalline moment. The pain in my chest wasn't the fever or the pneumonia anymore. It was the realization, a cold, unflinching truth. I looked at them both, mother and brother, and I smiled. Not a smile of happiness, not one of warmth. It was the smile of someone surveying a blueprint, spotting a load-bearing wall that had been compromised, knowing exactly how it would be taken down. Slowly, deliberately, I lowered myself back into the chair, hand steady, fork in hand. "Noted," I said. My voice was calm, collected, clear, not loud, not threatening, just a statement. The words hung in the air like a quiet reckoning, and in that silence, the story of my life unfolded before me. The sickness, the fatigue, the exhaustion, they weren't punishment. They were a gift, a revelation. They had given me the clarity to see the rot that had been poisoning my family, and through it, my own life, for decades. The betrayal wasn't the cold indifference of my mother, nor the sneering, sarcastic cruelty of my brother. It was everything I had enabled by staying silent, by letting them see my devotion as weakness, my labor as obligation. That smile wasn't joy, it was a first spark of resolve, of realization, of strategy. I could see it all, laid bare the years of invisible labor. The financial scaffolding I had provided, the silent maintenance of their lives at the cost of my own peace and health. The hum of the restaurant, once comforting in its soft luxury, now felt like a stage. Every crystal, every silver utensil, every flicker of candlelight was a spotlight on their entitlement and my exhaustion. But I had never been more alive, never more aware. I realized that their words, their jabs, their dismissive laughter had only given me the blueprint I needed to reclaim control. And that realization, that undeniable clarity, made the fever in my body feel like armor. The humiliation that had been clawing at my chest for years transformed into something else, a shield, a lens, a map. I can see every conversation, every interaction, every unacknowledged sacrifice laid out before me, every moment where I had swallowed my hurt, every time I had smiled through indignity, every instance I had funded their indulgences while they mocked, belittled, or ignored me. It all converged into one undeniable fact. They had miscalculated. They had underestimated me. I could almost hear the echoes of every silly girl, every "you're too sensitive," every sly laugh and subtle dig resonating in the room, bouncing back at them. And that gave me strength. A slow, steady, irrevocable strength that began at my feet and moved upward through my limbs until it pooled behind my eyes and in my chest. I wasn't the scared, compliant daughter anymore. I wasn't invisible. I wasn't a tool, an AT, or a service provider to be laughed at, scorned, or disregarded. I was something else, something far more dangerous in its quiet certainty. I realized in that moment that I had been playing a role for them for so long. And now I could step out of it. I could define the rules. I could decide the terms. And as I sat there, catching the subtle shifts in their expressions, the fleeting flicker of unease in Margaret's eye, the slight hesitation in Frank's posture, I understood that the balance had shifted. Not yet fully, not permanently, but enough to know that the leverage I had spent decades accumulating quietly, invisibly, was now mine to wield. And it was real. It was tangible. I could feel it in the subtle control of my muscles, the deliberate calm of my voice, the faint smirk that hovered just at the edge of my lips. They couldn't see it fully yet, but they were beginning to sense it. And that realization, oh, that delicious, exhilarating, terrifying realization was intoxicating. I realized that for the first time, I could hold my ground without fear, without collapse, without the usual ritual of sacrifice and invisibility that had marked every interaction with them for the past 20 years. That moment, right there at the head of the table, was mine. Every past indignity, every year of silent endurance, every insult, every snicker, every careless comment, they all became fuel, raw and unfiltered, igniting the sense of clarity and purpose that was now undeniable. And as I sat there, fevered and exhausted, yet entirely present, I understood something fundamental: the armor I had been given by illness, by the fever, by the pounding in my chest. It wasn't weakness. It was liberation. It was the lens I needed to see the structural flaws in the entire foundation of my family relationships. And suddenly, all the past resentment, all the quiet frustration, all the unseen effort converged into a single truth: I was done being invisible. I was done being the courtesy, the obligation, the invisible hand. I was done being the one who held the weight of everything so that everyone else could live without consequence. I could see every subtle misstep, every financial dependence, every emotional manipulation, and I knew it was my moment. And that moment, that tiny, piercing slice of time where the room seemed to freeze, where the crystal glasses held their sparkle a fraction too long, where every eye was on me, became my turning point. I had spoken, and though the words themselves were simple, they carried the weight of decades. And the clarity that followed wasn't just emotional, it was structural. It was as if, in speaking, I had drawn the blueprint for the dismantling of everything that had kept me trapped. The anger that had flared beneath my skin softened into a precise, deliberate energy, not reckless, not reactive, but controlled, like a surgeon surveying the operation before making the first cut. I felt my body shift slightly in the chair, the fever and fatigue receding into the background, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I could breathe not the shallow, sickly gasps I'd been taking, but a measured, calm understanding. I had survived the humiliation. I had survived the cruel words, the mocking tone, the laughter of a brother who thought he had power. And in that survival, I had gained clarity, strength, and a roadmap. And as I sank back into the chair, exhaling slowly, I knew that nothing would ever be the same. The scales had tipped, even if they didn't realize it yet. The room, the opulence, the whispers, the soft clinking of glasses, all of it faded into the background of a moment that was mine. The weight of years of unseen work, of unacknowledged sacrifice, had finally crystallized into awareness. And awareness, I realized, was power. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, it was simple, precise, and quietly terrifying. And in that quiet terror, I felt the first genuine thrill of liberation. When I finally got home that night, the apartment was quiet, sterile in the way that had always comforted me. A minimalist sanctuary where nothing demanded attention but the bare essentials. My body was trembling from the fever and exhaustion, but my mind was alive in a way it hadn't been for years. I collapsed into a chair near my desk, trying to catch my breath. the residual hum of the restaurant and its fake elegance still echoing in my chest. And then I looked around at the space I called my own, the one place in the world that belonged entirely to me, and it struck me. They had forgotten one fundamental truth: I was not just their ATM. I was the bank. The moment hit with the weight of a revelation. Every lease, every account, every asset they relied on: the condo on Riverwalk, the black sedan I had put in my name, the joint checking accounts that fed their every whim, they were all under my control. And I had never realized just how much. I slowly rose from the chair, fever making my steps uneven, and walked over to the built-in shelves that held more than just my architectural designs. They held the quiet scaffolding of a life I'd been silently funding for nearly 2 decades. Folders thick and heavy lined the shelves, labeled meticulously Condominium 18B Riverwalk, personal vehicle, joint accounts. My hands trembled as I pulled the black binder marked Condominium 18B from the shelf, sliding it open with a mix of dread and curiosity. There it was, the deed. My signature bold and clear at the bottom: Megan Elizabeth Vance, sole owner. Every line a quiet testament to the truth I had ignored for years. I owned the space they called home. Not a tenant, not a caretaker, the owner. My heart raced, part from fever, part from a realization that had been building for years, but only now crystallized. I went on to gather the next binder, the one holding the black sedan title. Again, my name dominated, absolute and unassailable. I flipped through the pages, noting how methodically I had arranged it all, yet how little I had let it influence my thinking at the time. And then, the joint account folder, account 8819 linked to my business accounts. Automatic transfers set up to cover every expense: meals, clothing, Frank's constant stream of failed ventures, Margaret's appointments, the condo utilities, every luxury. And in every case, I was the primary account holder, the one whose name carried legal weight. They were merely authorized users. And in that moment, sitting on the floor of my study, surrounded by the silent evidence of their dependency, a single thought repeated itself over and over in my mind: they had forgotten one crucial thing. They had forgotten who exactly I was. They had underestimated me. Every calculation, every presumption, every subtle or overt jab had been based on the lie they told themselves about my character. The boring, unfeeling daughter, the workaholic, the pushover. And here I was, feverish and sick, yet fully aware that the illusion had been shattered. They had mistaken my generosity for weakness, my competence for lack of personality, my silence for subservience. And now, suddenly, the ledger was clear. Every structure I had built for them, every dollar, every asset, every meticulous document was mine to control. I wasn't just a provider, I was the foundation. And foundations, if handled correctly, could bear immense weight or bring entire structures down. I leaned back, letting the weight of that realization wash over me. For so long, I had been playing a role that suited them: dutiful, invisible, patient. But the scales had tipped, and the ledger had been written by me, without fanfare, without recognition. And now, the power it represented was undeniable. I could see their entire world, all of the comforts they assumed were given, resting on a framework that I controlled. And that understanding awakened something in me, something that had been dormant under years of duty and unacknowledged effort as strategic, calculating side that I had cultivated through decades of managing complex projects, negotiating contracts, and holding multiple moving parts in perfect balance. The same mind that had calculated building blueprints and managed multi-million-dollar projects now saw the grid of their lives in terms of leverage, liability, and structural integrity. And in that moment, I realized that every past insult, every year of being overlooked, every frustration and moment of silent sacrifice had been preparation, not for reward, not for recognition, but for clarity, for precision, for understanding the mechanisms of power that even my mother and brother had failed to recognize. I spread the folders across the floor, organizing them methodically: condo, vehicle, accounts, stipends, utilities. Each document a silent soldier in the army of my foresight. My mind traced the threads of their dependence, mapping each flow of funds, each legal stipulation, each asset tied to my name. I could see clearly now where the leverage lay, where the boundaries could be enforced, and where, if necessary, walls could be drawn. I thought back over the years, the dinners I had funded, the parties I had organized, the bills I had paid, the luxury they had taken for granted, all the while enduring their jabs, their laughter, their casual cruelty, each slight, each offhand comment, each dismissive word now read as data points in a blueprint of manipulation and entitlement. And as I looked at the collection of papers, the sheer scope of what I had quietly constructed for them and what I could now control was staggering. I realized I had been underestimated at every turn, not because I lacked ability, but because I had allowed their perception of me to shape my interactions. They had never once stopped to consider what I actually did for a living. They thought the work, the precision, the daily navigation of contracts, negotiations, and deadlines was something that rendered me less personal, less human, less capable of asserting power in ways that truly mattered. But here I was, feverish, physically drained, yet completely in control. I was both the architect and the builder, but also now the strategist, the overseer, the one who knew the full scope of the construction and deconstruction of their lives. And that knowledge, more than anything else, was intoxicating. It gave me a sense of structure I hadn't felt in years, a sharp, exhilarating clarity. I wasn't just reacting anymore. I was anticipating, calculating, preparing. Each decision I can make now, each legal or financial move, was rooted in precision and authority, grounded in documentation and undeniable evidence. And with each folder I touched, with each document I reviewed, that strategic awareness expanded. I could trace the flow of every luxury they had enjoyed, every indulgence funded silently by me, every failed venture of francs that had been quietly covered, every manipulated transaction that Margaret had orchestrated with her charm and seeming innocence. And suddenly, it all became a map of leverage, control, and opportunity. And I understood, with a deep, unshakable certainty, that I would no longer allow the past to dictate the future. I would no longer allow myself to be invisible, disregarded, or mischaracterized. I was the architect of their lives, yes, but now I was the engineer of the consequence. The realization settled into me like a solid beam of steel, warm and terrifying all at once. And as I continued to sort, catalog, and absorb, I began to imagine the ways in which this clarity could be enacted, not in rash, impulsive revenge, but in precise, structured, undeniable steps that would bring balance, accountability, and finality to the chaos they had treated as entitlement. Every single flow of money, every document, every binding agreement, all within my control. I could see the sequence of actions required to assert authority and secure independence, to protect myself while dismantling the structures that had kept me trapped. And the more I examined, the more I realized that what I had always been told was coldness or unfeeling resolve, what my mother had called harshness or rigidity, was actually preparation. Preparation for this moment of absolute clarity, where the lines between personal feeling, legal reality, and financial leverage intersected with crystal precision. I felt my fever ebb slightly, replaced with a focused, icy awareness. Each breath, each beat of my heart, was now accompanied by the quiet thrill of understanding the depth of the control I had amassed silently over years of sacrifice. It was a dizzying, exhilarating awareness I could finally act, and my actions would be undeniable. There would be no debate over entitlement, no argument over who provided what, no room for manipulation. Everything was documented. Everything was in my name. Everything was mine to wield. And in that quiet, fevered study, surrounded by the infrastructure of their lives, I understood that this moment marked a fundamental shift, not just in my relationship with them, not just in my personal autonomy, but in my own perception of myself. I wasn't simply the dutiful daughter, the silent provider, the invisible laborer of comfort and luxury. I was powerful, I was prepared, I was strategic, I was awake, and that awakening, more than any action I would take later, was the foundation of the transformation that was already quietly beginning. I could feel it in the muscles of my back as I sat upright, in the steadying of my hands, in the slow, deliberate drawing of my breath. It was a grounding, precise, and irreversible moment. I had been underestimated, and now, finally, I understood the full measure of what that meant. The tables had turned, even if only in awareness. And that awareness, in a quiet, feverish apartment, surrounded by folders and deeds and titles, felt like the first step toward absolute, undeniable authority. The realization settled over me, simultaneously exhausting and invigorating. I wasn't just the builder of spaces, of schedules, of comfort. I was the orchestrator of consequence, and for the first time in decades, I understood exactly how to use that knowledge. Every document in front of me, every legal binding, every account and title became a tool, a weapon, a shield, and a foundation. And in that precise, quiet moment, I allowed myself a small, private smile, a knowing, calm, unstoppable awareness that, for once, the scales were not just tipping, they had tilted, and the balance, finally, was mine to hold. The next morning, I woke feeling like I'd been run over by a freight train. The pneumonia had dug in overnight, my chest tight, my head swimming, and every movement a reminder of just how sick I really was. But beneath the fog of illness, there was a sharp, crystalline clarity that hadn't existed before. I knew exactly what needed to happen, and for the first time, it wasn't about pleasing anyone or keeping the peace. I picked up the phone with trembling hands and dialed Chloe, my assistant, whose efficiency was a comfort even when I couldn't form full sentences. "Chloe, I croaked, my voice rough. I'm taking an immediate, indefinite medical leave. Cancel all my meetings. Forward critical matters to the second in command. She paused, just a fraction, and asked, concern in her tone. Everything. Even the presentation for the city council. I let out a shallow laugh, bitter and feverish, and croaked, everything, except one. I need you to book me a conference call with Graham. The mention of his name seemed to steady me in a way nothing else could. Graham wasn't just any lawyer, he was the sharpest corporate litigator I had ever met. The kind of man who could quietly dismantle a boardroom full of executives without raising his voice. He knew exactly how to read contracts, how to anticipate missteps, and, more importantly, how to exploit every loophole to ensure justice and clarity were served. 10 minutes from now, I added, and hung up before Chloe could protest or ask more questions. I wrapped myself in a thick shawl, shuffling to the kitchen island, the low morning light cutting across the minimalist space, and poured a glass of hot water with lemon. I sat, cupping the mug like a talisman, letting the heat seep into my hands while my mind raced through the steps ahead. Then the phone rang. Graham. His smooth baritone voice filled the quiet apartment. Chloe said it was urgent. You sound terrible. Are you all right? I managed a raspy, faintly amused reply. No, but I'm about to be. I outlined the situation, recounting the events of the night before the dinner. The humiliation, the fever, the unbearable weight of seeing them laugh and scorn me while I paid for every inch of their indulgence. Then I said it, slowly and deliberately. The words tasting of relief and resolve. You're here out of courtesy, not because you matter. At least they let you in. There was a pause on the line, the quiet before the storm. I could almost hear Graham's mind turning, calculating, the legal cogs spinning as he processed exactly what needed to happen. Courtesy as a legal concept is non-binding, and mattering isn't a prerequisite for tenancy, he said finally, calm, almost chilling in its precision. But a lease agreement, or lack thereof, certainly is. Tell me, Megan, what would you like to do? I swallowed, the words catching in my raw throat. I want them out, and I want every financial tie severed today. A faint smile, almost imperceptible, touched his voice. That's a sound structural decision. Let's review the blueprints. And in that simple phrase, I realized I wasn't just speaking about documents and accounts. I was speaking about leverage, power, and the infrastructure I had quietly built under their noses. They had assumed my generosity meant weakness. They had assumed my diligence meant I could be ignored. They had forgotten that I wasn't just the daughter or sister. They had forgotten I owned the foundation. I took a shaky breath, chest aching, and outlined the assets under my control, the Riverwalk condo, whose utilities, from power to internet, had been quietly charged to my firm's account, the car that I had bought and maintained in my name, the monthly stipend and the joint checking account that had funded years of indulgence for Margaret and Frank. Graham nodded in acknowledgement, every phrase crisp, precise. Excellent, he said. A severance of this nature is a simple 3-step process. First, we cut the cash flow. Second, we secure the assets. Third, we deliver the notice. Are you prepared to proceed with all 3? I swallowed again, feeling a wave of dizziness, the fever tugging at the edges of my resolve. But I managed a firm, clear. I am good, Graham replied. Step 1, I'll need you to come by my office to sign the fund transfer stop orders. Bring the deed and the car title. We'll transfer everything into a holding company effective immediately. Time to put a firewall between you and them. My lips curved into a small, private smile at the word firewall. I liked the sound of that, finally. Something that was entirely mine. That night, the fever was a distant hum compared to the surge of clarity coursing through my veins. Over the next 3 days, I navigated a feverish haze of antibiotics, cough syrup, and pure determination. My physical weakness was stark. I struggled to climb stairs. My limbs ached. My breath came in shallow bursts, but my mind was sharper than it had ever been. Every document I signed, every phone call I made, every carefully orchestrated instruction to Graham and Chloe was precise, measured, deliberate. And as the days unfolded, the reactions from Margaret and Frank arrived in predictable waves. 14 missed calls from Margaret, 22 texts from Frank. They were frantic, confused, enraged, all simultaneously. From Margaret Megan, I am very disappointed in your behavior. Walking out on your mother's birthday like that. You need to apologize. From Frank, hey, Mom's really upset. You made her cry. Not cool. And a cascade of others, messages and calls blending into a rapid-fire barrage. I read each one, letting the words wash over me, feeling the old sting of guilt and pressure, and let it slide, because I knew the leverage was mine. I didn't respond. I was too occupied with precision, with execution, with the clear, meticulous steps laid out in front of me. By day 3, I found myself in Graham's conference room, blinds drawn against the harsh afternoon light, sitting pale and feverish, a shadow of myself in appearance but razor sharp in intention. On the polished table lay the stack of freshly signed documents. I had physically dragged myself there, but once seated, I felt invincible. Graham insisted I recline on the plush sofa while he and his paralegal handled witnessing. Tea was brought to me, the warmth seeping into my hands. But the real warmth, the heat of satisfaction, was in the knowledge that the first step was already complete. The joint account was closed, funds transferred to a new account in my name only. Automatic transfers from my business account had been terminated. Step 1 done. Step 2 followed quickly. Utilities for the condo, once charged to my firm, were reassigned to Margaret and Frank. As Graham tapped the folder, I whispered, almost to myself, the realization settling like a solid weight. And the residents are Margaret and Frank. Precisely, he said, eyes glinting. They'd received their first unsubsidized bill, a disconnection notice more likely than not, within 48 hours. And finally, step 3, the formal notice to quit, a legal document that rendered every claim they had tenuous at best. Margaret and Frank were occupants at my discretion, and that discretion had been rescinded. 30 days to vacate. 30 days, I thought, feeling the fever and fatigue blur, yet every detail crystal clear. I could hear the tension through their frantic attempts to reach me, calls, texts, pleadings, threats. Margaret's high-pitched shrieks and Frank's panicked, barking texts filled the void of my silence, but I remained seated, composed, watching the chain reaction unfold. Every message, every call, every attempt at manipulation bounced off the fortified structure I had erected around myself. I sipped the tea, chest tight, lungs shallow, yet my mind soared with clarity. I was no longer reacting. I was orchestrating. The collapse of their entitlement, the unraveling of years of dependency, was now a process I controlled. Graham's guidance, precise and unerring, allowed me to execute each step flawlessly. The documents moved, the accounts were locked, the notices sent, and as their calls and texts intensified, a deep satisfaction began to settle within me, mixed with fatigue, but distinctly real. They were discovering, in real time, the consequences of their assumptions. Every expectation of effortless indulgence I had shattered, every presumption of compliance destroyed, and I realized, in that fevered, dizzy haze, that I had never felt so alive, despite the physical toll, the exhaustion, the persistent ache of illness. I felt a surge of power, of justice, of clarity. Each action taken was measured, deliberate, and irreversible. Margaret's pleas, Frank's fury, the confusion, the panic, they were all part of the architecture I had quietly designed over decades. And for once, I could witness it unfolding exactly as I had imagined. The confluence of physical weakness and mental acuity created a strange duality. My body protested, but my mind was clear. Each instruction I gave, each decision I made was rooted in understanding, in precision, in years of strategic patience. They didn't see it yet. They couldn't. Not fully, but the dominoes had started to fall. I leaned back in the chair, letting the fever and aches wash over me, and allowed a small, private grin. They had assumed they held power. They had assumed my compliance was eternal, but in reality, the power had always been mine. They just never knew how to access it. And more importantly, I had never known how to wield it. Until now. And as the hours passed, the calls kept coming, the texts kept piling up, and the documents continued their silent work. I sat, feverish and weak, yet unshakably focused. The satisfaction of finally seeing the infrastructure of entitlement crumble, legally and financially, was a quiet, consuming thrill. Every call ignored, every text unanswered, was a deliberate stroke of precision, a measure of control I had never permitted myself before. I could almost feel the weight of the years of unpaid gratitude, the exhaustion, the invisible labor, lifting, replaced by a sense of authority, autonomy, and, yes, justice. And in that delicate balance, I realized something fundamental: the illness, the fever, the physical frailty. They weren't limitations. They were, in their own strange way, shields. Shields that allowed me to act without distraction, to see clearly, to let the process unfold, to watch as the long-neglected truth of my authority became undeniable. Margaret and Frank were scrambling, panicked, lost, and completely unprepared for the precision with which the financial and legal structures they had depended on were being dismantled. And I, weak and fevered, seated in the cool, quiet room with Graham at my side, finally felt the first taste of freedom that had been withheld from me for decades. It was the thrill of power, not wielded recklessly, but calculated, precise, and complete. And as I sipped the last of my tea, listening to the faint hum of the city outside, I realized the first steps had been taken, and that the course of the next few days, though tense, chaotic, and emotionally charged for them, would be mine to direct with unwavering clarity and resolve. 3 days later, I was finally cleared to leave my apartment for a few hours. Still pale, still moving slower than usual. Every step reminding me that my body was a fragile instrument recovering from pneumonia. I had barely begun to adjust to the rhythm of normalcy when the pounding started. First, a sharp rap at the door, then a muffled shout. My heart lurched. My initial thought was pain or fever, but no, this was deliberate. I stumbled to the door, each movement heavy and sluggish, and peeked through the peephole. There they were, Margaret and Frank, standing in my foyer like invaders in a place they had no claim to. My blood ran cold and then hot, a mix of rage and disbelief. They had never, not once in 17 years, appeared at my apartment unannounced. They had always hated my neighborhood, my building, the way I lived my life quietly. And now, here they were, demanding access as if it were their right. The pounding resumed, louder this time, accompanied by Frank's muffled voice. "Megan, open this door. We know you're in there. Your car is in the garage, and then Margaret's high." Thin voice, cut in, frantic, almost hysterical. "This is absurd. Megan, open up. You are in so much trouble." Trouble. The word felt absurd to me, almost comical if it weren't so infuriating. I leaned my forehead against the cool wood of the door and considered my options. I could ignore them. I could call building security. I could let the law take its course. But then I heard Margaret's voice again, desperate, clipped, demanding. That was it. The icy rage crystallized inside me, clearing the fog that pneumonia and fever had left behind. I unlatched the deadbolt, bracing myself, and swung the door open. They practically fell into the foyer, propelled by their own righteous indignation. Frank, his face a brilliant shade of red, surged forward, leading the charge. Margaret trailed behind, clutching her pearls and shaking a crumpled letter, her eyes wide with indignation. Both were talking at once, voices overlapping in a chaotic, desperate chorus. Margaret waved the crumpled letter, shrieking. "What is the meaning of this?" Frank followed up with a panicked, cracking voice. "Eviction. Are you out of your mind? You shut off our money." I stood there, feeling a strange, controlled calm settle over me. My body was weak. Yes, every muscle screaming in protest. But my mind was clear, focused. I looked at them both, truly looked, and the sheer absurdity of their panic was almost satisfying. Their entitlement had built itself up so high that the fall was going to be spectacular. I just looked at them. I began, voice low but steady, rasping slightly from illness, and realized this is exactly what accountability looks like. They faltered, momentarily stunned by the lack of fear or panic in my tone. Frank, still red-faced and incredulous, sputtered. "My card declined at Starbucks, Megan. Do you know how humiliating this is?" I let out a shallow, almost amused breath, letting the words hang in the air. Humiliating. Yes. But the humiliation was theirs, not mine. I allowed the quiet to stretch, their panic filling the space with tension. I took a measured step into the apartment, slow and deliberate, and lowered myself onto the sofa, the cool leather grounding me. They followed, expecting confrontation, expecting pleading, expecting fear. Instead, they found me calm, composed, in control. "You have 5 minutes, I said, voice steady. "My doctor says I'm not supposed to have any stress." Margaret's screams split the air, disbelief dripping from every syllable. "Stress? You're talking to me about stress? You cut us off. You're throwing your own mother out on the street." I lifted my head, eyes meeting hers evenly. "I am not," I said softly, almost conversationally. I am asking the occupants of my property to vacate, as is my right as the owner." Her face went blank, disbelief warring with rising panic. "Your property? That's my home. Your father and dad's been gone 17 years. I cut in, voice sharp. "You and Frank burned through his entire estate in 3. The condo is not your home. It's real estate I purchased and legally own. I've graciously allowed you to live here rent-free for over a decade and a half. That ends today." Frank scoffed, folding his arms in mock defiance, trying to regain some semblance of authority. "Oh, here we go. Look at me, Megan. I'm so successful. I pay for everything. You love holding this over us, don't you? It makes you feel big." "No." "Frank," I said, calm and measured, meeting his gaze. "It makes me tired. It makes me sick. And as of 3 days ago, it makes me finished." Margaret's voice changed, shifting into a disappointed, practiced tone. "This isn't how you were raised. A family takes care of each other." A short, harsh laugh erupted from me, cutting through the tension. It turned into a hacking cough, my lungs protesting, my body weak, but my resolve unbroken. I pressed a tissue to my mouth and shook my head. "A family, is that what we are?" "At your birthday dinner, in front of 20 people, you told me I don't matter, that I was only there as a courtesy." I pointed, trembling slightly from fever and emotion, at Frank. "And you," I said, voice raw, laughed. "At least they let you in." Frank looked away, the memory stinging him, even as he tried to mask it. Margaret, unimpressed, waved dismissively. "Oh, for heaven's sake, you're still on about that. It was a party. I was joking. You're always so sensitive, Megan. You can't take a joke." I drew in a long, measured breath, letting the words cut through the room. "It wasn't a joke. Mom, that was the first honest thing you've said to me in 20 years. I am not your daughter. I am not your sister. I am your courtesy. And my courtesy has just been revoked." The air shifted, heavy and suffocating with disbelief and sudden awareness. I stood slowly, legs shaking but steady in purpose, and walked back to the door. "Get out." My voice was calm, firm, and absolute. "We're not going anywhere," Frank blustered, trying desperately to reclaim some authority. "You can't just kick us out. You have rights." "No, Frank," I said, the weight of the past 17 years behind every word. "You don't. You have privileges. Privileges that I paid for, and I'm done. The letter from my lawyer is not a suggestion. It is a legal notification. You have 30 days. Margaret's face contorted, panic breaking through any pretense. "Where are we supposed to go? We have no money." I let that hang for a moment, letting the gravity sink in. "That," I said, slow and deliberate, "is an excellent question. One you probably should have asked yourselves before humiliating the only person who has been keeping you afloat. Frank, maybe it's time that brilliant mind of yours finally gets a job. You have 30 days to figure it out." Frank's face twisted with rage. "You'll be sorry," he hissed, jabbing a finger at me. "You can't do this to us. I'll tell everyone what you did. I'll tell them how you abandoned your family." I allowed a faint, cold smile to curve my lips. "Go ahead," I said, my voice firm, unyielding. "Tell them, and while you're at it, tell them about the condo I paid for, the car I paid for, the food you ate, the clothes you wore, the phone you're holding. Tell them the whole story. Frank, see who they side with." He paled. No words came. I repeated myself. louder this time. "Get out." Margaret, realizing the tide had turned, tried one last manipulation. "Megan, baby," she said, voice thick with false tears. "You're sick. You're not thinking straight. Let's just calm down. Why don't you call your bank and fix this? We can talk about it." I looked at her, steady and unwavering. "Noted," I said, and then, finally, the moment of clarity settled over the foyer. They had nowhere left to manipulate, nowhere to claim entitlement. And I had never felt more satisfied, even amidst the physical ache of illness. I closed the door, sliding the deadbolt into place, my heart hammering, but my mind perfectly composed. The confrontation was over. The power, for the first time, had fully shifted after the door clicked shut behind Margaret and Frank. The silence in my apartment was almost shocking. No pleading, no shouting, just the quiet hum of my space. I sank onto the sofa, letting my body slump against the cushions. And for the first time in years, I allowed myself to breathe without tension. The fever still tugged at me. The pneumonia still whispered with every shallow breath. But beneath it all, a strange sense of relief settled in. I was finally free from the constant drain, the manipulation, the invisible labor that had defined my relationship with them for decades. Over the next 6 weeks, I allowed myself to heal. I slept. I read novels I'd been meaning to touch for years. I walked in the park, feeling the crisp air fill my lungs without the weight of responsibility pressing down. I even found joy in the small things, the sunlight streaming through my minimalist apartment, the quiet of not having to answer another frantic call. Each day, I felt pieces of my energy, my health, and my peace return. It was like reclaiming a life I'd been borrowing for someone else all this time. Meanwhile, life for Margaret and Frank had changed dramatically. With no access to the condo, the car, or the monthly stipend, they were forced to face a reality they'd long ignored. As I had predicted, they moved in with Aunt Patty. Now, Aunt Patty was a different kind of authority, stern, practical, and not the least bit tolerant of Frank's antics or Margaret's theatrics. She immediately set rules, turning their lives upside down. Margaret, the once untouchable socialite, was put in charge of cooking and cleaning, while Frank, at 42, finally landed a job at a distribution warehouse, working a shift packing boxes. The image of him, once the golden boy of indulgence, now bleary-eyed and exhausted at dawn, was almost comical. I had to stifle a laugh when I heard the updates. It was a quiet, mundane justice, and in some ways, it felt more fitting than any courtroom verdict. As for me, my world began to expand. With the financial and emotional drain lifted, I could finally focus on my own life and my work. My firm landed the city council project I had almost missed, opening doors to ambitious new designs. I traveled, sketched, and began imagining not just buildings, but a life fully my own. Every decision I made now was mine alone, untainted by obligation or fear of family reprisal. About 6 months after the eviction, I was celebrating a successful quarter with Graham, my lawyer, who had been the steady hand throughout the ordeal. We were having dinner, laughing quietly about small victories, when he slid a small envelope across the table. I opened it and found a cashier's check for a surprisingly specific amount. "What's this?" I asked, genuinely curious. Graham smiled faintly. "Your Aunt Patty. She called my office. She said Frank is going to pay you back even if she has to garnish his wages herself. This is the first installment, 20% of his weekly paycheck for the rest of his life, or until she says otherwise. I looked at the check, $84.12. The amount was almost absurd, but the symbolism was perfect. I laughed, really laughed deep from my belly. The kind of laughter that shakes you and leaves you lighter than you've been in years. It wasn't just about the money. It was about acknowledgement, the recognition that justice, however small, had finally been served. I slid the check back to Graham with a grin. "Keep it," I said. "Maybe start a scholarship fund for aspiring architects or just buy the office some really good coffee." There was an almost tangible sense of completion, a feeling that the years of struggle, the exhaustion, and the sacrifices had finally led to something tangible. My freedom, my health, my life back in my own hands. As I sat there, sipping the last of my drink, I allowed myself to feel the weight of the journey lift. The confrontation, the legal battles, the careful dismantling of my family's reliance on me. It had been exhausting, physically and emotionally. But it had worked. The silence that followed, now permanent, was blissful. I didn't need to check my phone for the next crisis, brace for the next manipulative call, or endure another sarcastic jab. The peace was unbroken, the freedom complete, and in that quiet, with the city lights faintly twinkling outside my window, I felt an unexpected, profound satisfaction. Not the thrill of revenge, not the sharp sting of seeing them finally accountable, but the deep, comforting knowledge that I had reclaimed my life. I was no longer the one bending, giving, and absorbing. I was the one building, designing, and deciding architect not just of buildings, but of my own life. And finally, it felt exactly as it should, quiet, steady, and completely mine. And there it is. Megan finally has her life back, free from the weight of entitlement and manipulation. She can breathe, focus on her work, her health, and the little joys she's been missing for years. It's a story of quiet strength, resilience, and reclaiming control. Think about it. How would you handle something like this if this story made you pause or gave you a little hope? Maybe stick around for more tales like this. Just hit like or subscribe if you want to.